Picture a street in North London. Late August, 1977. The name of the street is Green Street, in a borough called Enfield. A perfectly ordinary place, rows of council houses, brick-terraced homes standing shoulder to shoulder, uniform, unassuming. The kind of street where everyone knows the rhythm of the bin lorries and the exact time the postman arrives. The first tremor in their reality came not with a scream, but with a complaint. Janet and her younger brother Pete were in the bedroom they shared, and they called out to their mother. Their beds were shaking, they said. Peggy, exhausted and probably assuming it was just the usual bedtime shenanigans, told them to stop messing about and go to sleep. It's a response any parent would have, but the complaints didn't stop. They became more insistent, tinged with a genuine fear that Peggy couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, she went into their room, ready to deliver a stern lecture. But the room was still. The children were wide-eyed in their beds, swearing they weren't doing anything. She checked for loose floorboards, for vibrations from the street, for any logical explanation. Finding none, she took the casters off the beds and told them, firmly, to go to sleep. But then, as she was turning to leave, she heard it. A shuffling sound, not from the children, but from the other side of the room. She turned back, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and she saw it. A heavy oak chest of drawers, a solid piece of furniture, slid. It didn't jolt or fall. It moved, deliberately, about 18 inches across the floor. In that moment, Peggy Hodgson's world tilted on its axis. The rational, explainable universe she inhabited simply fractured. This wasn't a game. This wasn't the children. This was something else. Panic set in, cold and sharp. She pushed the chest back, but it slid out again, refusing to stay put. Then the knocking started, a slow, rhythmic tapping from within the walls. 4 distinct knocks, a pause, then 4 more. The family, now huddled together in the living room, terrified, realized the sound was following them from room to room. The house was no longer their sanctuary. It was alive, and it was watching them. In a state of pure terror, Peggy did the only thing she could think of. She gathered her children, ran across the street to her neighbours, the Nottinghams, and called the police. The Hodgson family were distraught. The neighbours were bewildered. WPC Heaps, a trained professional observer, walked into the living room, her mind running through all the rational explanations. And then she saw it for herself. As she stood there, a blue armchair, with no one near it, lifted several inches off the floor and moved, as she later described in a signed witness statement, about 3 to 4 feet across the room. She checked it for wires, for tricks, for any conceivable mechanism that could explain what she had just witnessed. There was nothing. This was the critical turning point. The Enfield case was no longer just the story of a frightened family. It was now a phenomenon with a police witness. The official report from that night logs unexplained circumstances and moving furniture. The testimony of WPC Heaps elevated the story from a potential delusion into a documented event, a report filed away in the annals of the Metropolitan Police. The whispers from inside the house were starting to be heard by the outside world, and the haunting of Green Street was about to begin in earnest. To truly understand what happened at Enfield, you have to understand the psychological soil in which these strange seeds were planted. The Hodgson family was, by any measure, under considerable stress long before the knocking started. Peggy was recently and acrimoniously divorced, left to raise 4 children alone in a council house with very little money. The emotional turmoil of a broken home hangs heavy in the air of any house, and 284 Green Street was no exception. The children were coping with the absence of their father, a disruptive and painful new reality. Janet, who would soon become the focal point of the entire saga, was an 11-year-old girl on the precipice of puberty, that tumultuous biological and emotional threshold where a child begins the messy transition into an adult. It's a period of intense hormonal change, emotional volatility, and psychological vulnerability. paranormal lore is saturated with cases of poltergeist activity, a German term meaning noisy ghost, centering around adolescent girls. The theory is that the raw, chaotic, psychokinetic energy unleashed during puberty can, in rare cases, manifest externally, causing objects to fly and strange noises to occur. So, when we look at the Enfield case, we cannot ignore the initial shuffling of furniture and the rhythmic knocking were just the overture. Very quickly, the phenomenon escalated, becoming more varied, more violent, and infinitely more personal. It was as if something was testing its own strength, growing bolder with each passing day. Lego bricks and marbles would suddenly launch themselves through the air, propelled by an unseen force, ricocheting off walls with sharp, startling cracks. They were often hot to the touch, as if they had been superheated from within. The family would be sitting in a room, and a cushion would lift off a sofa and fly across the space. Spoons would bend and contort in drawers. Puddles of water would spontaneously appear on the kitchen floor. The house was in a constant state of low-grade warfare. The children were terrified to go to sleep. Janet and Margaret complained of being thrown out of their beds by an invisible force, of their blankets being ripped from them in the middle of the night. The knocking evolved into something more sinister. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was on doors, on furniture, seeming to come from every direction at once. And sometimes, amidst the chaos, they would hear the distinct, guttural sound of a dog barking, a sound that would echo through the house for a moment and then vanish. There was, of course, no dog. The family was living in a state of siege, prisoners in a home that had turned against them, tormented by an invisible, mischievous, and increasingly malevolent entity. Word of the strange happenings at Green Street eventually reached the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, an organization founded in the 19th century to scientifically investigate claims of the paranormal. They dispatched an investigator named Maurice Grosse. Grosse was not your typical academic researcher. He was an inventor, a kind-hearted man in his late 50s, but he was also a man haunted by his own profound personal tragedy. A year earlier, his beloved daughter Janet had been tragically killed in a motorcycle accident. When he heard about a potential poltergeist case centered around a young girl, also named Janet, it's impossible to believe this wasn't a powerful motivating factor for him. He arrived at 284 Green Street, not just as an objective investigator, but as a grieving father, perhaps subconsciously seeking a connection to the daughter he had lost. He saw the genuine terror in Peggy Hodgson's eyes, the exhaustion and fear etched onto the faces of her children. He believed them. Grosse immediately set up his equipment, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, cameras and notepads, determined to capture definitive proof of what was happening. He would spend countless nights in that cold, chaotic house, sitting in the dark, patiently waiting for the entity to perform. His presence was both a comfort to the family and a catalyst. With Grosse there to document everything, the entity, it seemed, was about to put on its most dramatic and terrifying show yet. Soon after Grosse began his investigation, he was joined by another researcher, Lyon Playfair. If Grosse was the heart of the investigation, driven by empathy and a personal need to believe, Playfair was its skeptical mind. A Cambridge-educated author and journalist who had spent years investigating paranormal phenomena in Brazil, Playfair was more seasoned, more wary of hoaxes, and more dedicated to a rigorous, methodical approach. He and Grosse formed an unlikely partnership, the grieving father and the cynical intellectual, both united in their quest to understand the bizarre events unfolding at Enfield. Their dynamic was crucial. Playfair would often challenge Grosse's more enthusiastic interpretations, forcing them both to look for rational explanations before jumping to paranormal conclusions. Together, they embarked on one of the most exhaustive paranormal. They took thousands of photographs. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, neighbours, social workers, even the local lollipop lady. They were relentless in their pursuit of evidence, creating an unprecedented archive of a haunting in progress. Whether you believe the Enfield Poltergeist was a ghost or a grand deception, The sheer volume and detail of the documentation collected by Grosse and Playfair is what makes this case so utterly compelling and impossible to dismiss outright. They ensured that the whispers in that small council house would echo for decades to come. The investigation took a dramatic and chilling turn when the entity began to speak. It started with strange wheet and whack coming from Janet, even when her mouth was closed. But then it evolved. A new voice emerged, not from the walls but from Janet herself. It was a deep, guttural, rasping sound, the voice of a cantankerous old man, and it was utterly terrifying. It would come on suddenly, an alien presence hijacking the vocal cords of an 11-year-old girl. This voice claimed to have a name, Bill Wilkins. Through long, rambling, and often profane conversations recorded by Maurice Grosse, Bill told his story. He said he had lived in the house before the Hodgsons. He had gone blind and then, one night, he'd had a hemorrhage right there in the living room. "I died in that chair," the voice rasped, in the corner downstairs. These recordings are perhaps the most famous and unsettling pieces of evidence from the entire case. Linguists and voice experts who later analysed the tapes confirmed that the sound wasn't being produced by Janet's normal vocal cords, but by her false vocal folds, a technique that is extremely difficult to maintain for long periods without causing damage, and is almost impossible for a child to master. The voice of Bill Wilkins transformed the case. This was no longer a simple, noisy ghost throwing things around. This was an apparently intelligent, communicating entity, a personality from beyond the grave using a child as its mouthpiece. It was direct, terrifying, and seemingly irrefutable proof that something conscious was haunting 284 Green Street. As news of the talking poltergeist leaked out, the media descended on Green Street like a pack of hungry wolves. The Daily Mirror, in particular, took a keen interest, plastering the story across its front pages. Suddenly, the Hodgsons' private terror became a public spectacle. Reporters camped outside their front door. Photographers with telephoto lenses tried to snatch pictures through the windows, and an endless stream of paranormal enthusiasts, religious figures, and morbid curiosity seekers flocked to the quiet suburban street. The house became a fishbowl. The family, especially Janet, was thrust into an uncomfortable and overwhelming spotlight. They were no longer just a family. They were a phenomenon, a freak show. This intense media scrutiny had a profound and complicated effect on the case. On one hand, it brought more witnesses and more documentation. On the other, it created immense pressure. The entity did not perform on demand. When a TV crew was there, the house might be silent. When a reporter was interviewing the family, the objects might stay stubbornly put. This created an expectation, a need for the haunting to be constant and spectacular. For the skeptics, this media circus provided the perfect motive for a hoax. What better way for a family struggling with poverty and anonymity to get attention and perhaps even financial gain? The line between genuine phenomena and performance became dangerously blurred. The presence of the cameras and the notebooks changed the very nature of the events, turning a raw, terrifying experience into a piece of public entertainment. And in so doing, it cast a permanent shadow of doubt over everything that happened within those walls. Amidst the media frenzy, the physical phenomena reached their apex, producing the most iconic and controversial images of the entire case. The most famous of these are the photographs that appear to show Janet levitating. Taken by a remote-controlled camera set up in the girl's bedroom, the sequence of blurry, black and white images shows Janet airborne, her body contorted in a strange, horizontal position, her face a mask of what looks like either terror or ecstasy. To believers, these photos are the Holy Grail, proof that the poltergeist could defy the laws of gravity, lifting a young girl into the air. To skeptics, fires would spontaneously ignite, with small blazes appearing in wastepaper baskets or on top of cupboards, only to extinguish themselves just as mysteriously. Metal objects, most famously spoons and even a heavy iron grate from the fireplace, were seen to bend and twist as if they were made of soft clay. Guy Lyon Playfair himself documented an incident where he saw a book fly from a shelf, turn a right angle in mid-air, and land at his feet. The sheer relentless variety of the phenomena was staggering. It wasn't just one type of activity. It was a full-spectrum assault on the senses and on the laws of physics. A chaotic, theatrical, and terrifying display that left even the most hardened observers struggling to find a rational explanation. As Grosse and Playfair became more convinced that they were dealing with a genuine paranormal entity, other members of the Society for Psychical Research grew increasingly skeptical. Two investigators in particular, Anita Gregory and John Beloff, became the primary voices of doubt. They visited the house and came away with a very different impression. They saw two mischievous, intelligent girls who seemed to be enjoying the attention a little too much. They argued that Grosse, in his grief, had become too emotionally involved, losing his objectivity and leading the witnesses. They pointed out that the most dramatic phenomena often seemed to happen when the girls were alone or not being directly observed. Their skepticism culminated in a moment that would become the smoking gun for everyone who believed the case was a hoax. A video camera had been set up secretly in an adjoining room, its lens peeking through a small hole in the wall. The footage captured Janet, alone in her room, deliberately bending a spoon and then looking around to see if anyone was watching. She was also seen trying to bang a broom handle against the ceiling to create the knocking sounds that had so terrified her family. It was undeniable proof of trickery. When confronted, Janet and her sister Margaret admitted to faking some of the events. Janet's famous quote was, "Oh yeah, once or twice we faked things, just to see if Mr. Grosse and Mr. Playfair would catch us. And they always did." This admission was a bombshell. For the skeptics, the case was closed. If they faked it once, they faked it all. For the believers, it was far more complicated. How could a few instances of childish pranks explain the mountain of other evidence, including the police officer's testimony and the voice of Bill Wilkins? The discovery of fraud didn't solve the mystery. It just made it infinitely more complex and frustrating. While the skeptics focused on the girls' trickery, they often conveniently overlooked the powerful testimony of numerous independent, adult witnesses who had nothing to gain from the story. It wasn't just Peggy Hodgson's word against the world. Her neighbours on both sides, the Nottinghams and the Burkhams, gave statements about the strange events they had experienced. The Nottinghams reported hearing the same rhythmic knocking coming through their shared party wall, even when they knew the Hodgson family was not at home. Vic Nottingham, a builder, went into the house himself to investigate and was hit on the head by a Lego brick that seemed to fly out of thin air. A local baker, who came to the door to make a delivery, witnessed a toy car moving on its own across the kitchen floor. A social worker visiting the family saw a T-shirt levitate from a chair and float across the room. And of course, there is the unshakable testimony of WPC Carolyn Heaps, the police officer who saw the chair move. These were not suggestible children or grieving paranormal investigators. These were ordinary people, a builder, a baker, a police officer, all reporting extraordinary things. A simple hoax perpetrated by two young girls becomes much harder to sustain when you factor in this chorus of corroborating witnesses. If Janet was just banging a broom on the ceiling, how did her neighbours hear the same sounds when she was at school? If it was all just wires and tricks, how did they fool so many different adults on so many different occasions? This inconvenient web of external testimony is what keeps the Enfield case from being easily dismissed, and what forces us to confront the possibility that at least some of what happened was genuinely unexplainable. Now, let's wade into the controversial waters. Let's talk about that admission of hoaxing. Janet herself said they faked about 2% of investigators move in. The world's media is camped on your lawn. You are the centre of a global storm. Everyone is watching you, waiting for the ghost to perform. But poltergeists, if they exist, are notoriously capricious. They don't perform on a schedule. So what do you do when the TV cameras are rolling and nothing is happening? What do you do when the investigators who have become your friends and protectors look disappointed? Is it so hard to believe that a scared, confused child might try to help things along? That she might bend a spoon or make a noise to satisfy the immense pressure and expectation being placed upon her? This isn't necessarily the act of a master manipulator or a fraud. It could be the desperate act of a child caught in a situation far beyond her comprehension. To dismiss the mountain of evidence, the police testimony, the voice of Bill Wilkins, the dozens of adult witnesses, because a child once bent a spoon under immense pressure is, in my opinion, a failure of imagination. It's an easy answer to a profoundly difficult question. The other major rational explanation put forward is mass hysteria, or a shared delusion, sometimes called folie à deux, or folie en famille. The theory goes that it all started in the mind of Peggy Hodgson, a woman under incredible stress. Her anxiety and suggestibility created a fertile ground for misinterpretation. A normal creak of the house becomes a ghostly knock. A shadow becomes an apparition. This potent belief system is then transferred to her children, who are equally vulnerable. The investigators, Maurice Grosse and Lyon Playfair, arrive already wanting to believe in the paranormal, and they amplify the delusion, seeing ghosts where there are only drafts and creaks. The media then broadcasts this hysteria to the public, and soon everyone who enters the house is primed to experience something supernatural. It's a compelling psychological argument, and it likely explains a part of what happened. The power of suggestion is undeniable. However, the theory of mass hysteria runs into a very solid, very physical brick wall. Hysteria can explain why someone thinks they saw a chair move. It cannot explain how a police officer, a trained and skeptical observer, actually sees a chair levitate and move 4 feet across a room, an event she documents in an official police report. Mass hysteria is a powerful force, but it does not grant people the power of psychokinesis. The physical, objective nature of many of the reported events stretches the theory of a shared delusion to its absolute breaking point. For me, the single most compelling piece of evidence, the one that is hardest to dismiss with any conventional explanation, is the voice of Bill Wilkins and the information it provided. Remember, the voice claimed to be an old man who had died in the house before the Hodgsons moved in. It gave specific details, that it had been sitting in the armchair in the corner when it suffered a fatal hemorrhage. At the time, this was just a story coming from a creepy voice. But years later, a man named Terry Wilkins came forward. He was Bill Wilkins's son. He confirmed, on tape, that everything the voice had said was true. His father, Bill Wilkins, had lived and died in that house. And he had, in fact, died of a cerebral hemorrhage while sitting in his favourite armchair in the corner of the living room. Now, let's be critical about this. How could Janet Hodgson, an 11-year-old girl in 1977, have known these specific, verifiable details? This was decades before the internet, before you could easily look up the history of a property online. The skeptics argue that it must have been local gossip, that the kids overheard someone talking about the old man who died in their house and incorporated it into their prank. But there is absolutely no evidence to support this. The Hodgsons and the Wilkinses didn't know each other. There was no obvious channel through which this information could have passed. The specificity of the cause of death, the location, the name, it all points to knowledge that Janet should not have had access to. This piece of the puzzle simply doesn't fit into the hoax or hysteria theory. It suggests an external, intelligent source of information. And that is a truly chilling and profound possibility. So, after all this, what do I believe really happened at 284 Green Street? I don't believe it was a simple choice between real or fake. I think the truth is a messy, chaotic, and uncomfortable hybrid of both. My personal theory is this. I believe something genuinely paranormal and unexplained sparked the events at Enfield. Perhaps it was a latent energy in the house. Perhaps it was Ultimately, the enduring legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist might not be about ghosts at all, but about the nature of belief itself. The case acts as a perfect Rorschach test for the human worldview. Believers look at the photographs, listen to the recordings of Bill Wilkins, and see undeniable proof of life after death. Skeptics look at the very same evidence and see a clever hoax, a jumping child, and a case of ventriloquism. Psychologists see a textbook example of mass hysteria and the trauma of a broken family manifesting in strange ways. The fascinating thing is that the evidence is just ambiguous enough to support all of these conclusions. No one who went into the case as a skeptic came out a believer, and no believer was ever truly convinced it was all a fraud. The case didn't change minds. It simply reinforced pre-existing beliefs. It demonstrates that when confronted with something that lies outside our understanding, we don't often seek objective truth. Instead, we seek evidence that confirms the story we already tell ourselves about how the world works. The Enfield case holds up a mirror to us, and the ghost we see staring back is often just a reflection of our own hopes, fears, and biases. It's not a story that provides answers. It's a story that reveals the very mechanics of how we choose what to believe. And in all this debate about evidence, belief, and the paranormal, it is tragically easy to forget the human beings at the heart of the story. For the Hodgson family, this was not an interesting intellectual puzzle or a spooky piece of entertainment. It was 2 years of unrelenting terror and public scrutiny that left deep and lasting scars. Janet, in interviews as an adult, spoke with profound sadness about how the poltergeist stole her childhood. She was bullied mercilessly at school, called Ghost Girl. The family was ostracized by many in their community. Their home, the one place they should have felt safe, became a source of constant fear and anxiety. After the phenomena finally died down and the investigators and reporters packed up and left, the family was left to pick up the pieces of their lives, forever marked by what they had experienced. Regardless of the ultimate cause, whether it was a disembodied spirit, a psychological breakdown, or a childish prank that spiraled out of control, the suffering of the Hodgson family was undeniably real. Their trauma is perhaps the most concrete and haunting piece of evidence in the entire case. The true horror of Enfield may not have been the knocking in the walls, but the profound and devastating human cost of being at the center of such an extraordinary storm. So, was the Enfield poltergeist a real haunting or a case of mass hysteria? To ask the question is to miss the point. The case resists a simple answer because it is not a simple story. It is a sprawling, contradictory, and deeply human mess of fear, faith, doubt, and desperation. It is a story with police officers who saw ghosts and children who faked them. It is a story with audio recordings of the dead and video recordings of trickery. It is a story that contains enough evidence to convince you of the paranormal and enough doubt to make you question everything. The Enfield poltergeist endures in our collective consciousness not because it was ever solved, but precisely because it wasn't. It remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the paranormal world, a permanent fixture in the twilight territory between the known and the unknown. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the world is far stranger than our philosophies allow for, and that there are some whispers from the dark that we may never truly be able to explain. They simply echo on, forever challenging the comfortable boundaries of our reality.